points of view and also resource that we need to tap into. So with that, let me open for maybe just a quick introduction of your background, Anthony, for those that are joining us for the first time.
Yeah, so Anthony Hannon, like Val said, I am a fellow in the CEO Action for Racial Equity Fellowship. It was founded by PwC and a number of other CEOs. Originally started out as CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, with the focus on the CEOs taking diversity, equity, and inclusion practices back to their own home organizations. In 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, we wanted to do more as a leadership group. And we wanted to focus on the Black community and racial equity there externally for all Black Americans, focusing on 4 areas: economics, education, healthcare, and public safety. So I believe around 78 companies came together, contributed fellows. MassMutual, for example, contributed 6. PwC had upwards of 20, 30 employees. And all the other companies contributed a number of fellows to focus on this work for the Black community, and ultimately focus on public policy work as well as social contract work. So with the companies that have contributed and signed on to the CEO Action for Racial Equity, getting them involved with the Black community. So for example, I'm working on a solution for increasing corporate engagement with historically Black colleges and universities. Also, our second social contract is increasing business diversity with third-party suppliers, and then fair chance hiring for formerly justice-involved individuals. So that's where I'm committed to right now. My core background is in cybersecurity, lead a group of information security officers and security architects. So yeah.
Great to have you, Anthony. And I think bringing that two together is basically what we were looking for in cyber capacity. Jen?
Yeah, so I'm Jen Foy. I lead the domestic work of World Relief, an international nonprofit. And in my day-to-day, I am helping refugees and other immigrants integrate into our communities. And a big part of that work is helping people get meaningful jobs and what that looks like and how we connect them not just into a janitorial job, but going from that to the heart surgeon that was a heart surgeon in Iraq. How do we get him back into the medical industry here? Similarly, how Val and I connected, a lot of Afghans have experience in cybersecurity. How do we find those people and help them get into cybersecurity jobs here in the US? So really working on getting people into meaningful jobs and making sure they're entering welcoming and inclusive workforces.
Absolutely. And then I don't think, even a few years back, we were thinking about those angles. So when you combine the opportunity that we have, and now, as we are almost getting ready to support the Afghans, we have the Ukrainian situation now, which puts another twist and, of course, another set of great talent in the country. Let me go back to Anthony, in terms of the activities around CEO Action for Racial Equity. How do you see cybersecurity as an industry, benefiting from that, and also what resources are available that we can make to the industry?
Yeah, and we heard a little bit about it, right, or a lot about it, really, all week. We're addressing and improving the talent for cybersecurity, and at the core of it is diversity, equity, inclusion, right, regardless of what the issue or the opportunity that we're talking about. So with CEO Action for Racial Equity, there's a lot of education rooted in how we address these systemic issues, right? It took hundreds and hundreds of years to get to where we are today, both good and bad. And so we have to educate the companies and educate the employees too that work for these companies about why we need to do this work, why this work is important. Cybersecurity needs to be more diverse, right? We need more women, we need more people of color, we need that neurodiversity that Kristen talked about this morning. Because we face diverse threats, right? And threats that are always changing. And we need diverse defenders on the other side to combat those threats. As far as resources, like I mentioned before, we had a lot of the education pieces, but having discussions with SOFAL partners about apprenticeship programs that we can get with these companies and kind of lower that barrier to entry and better prepare the next generation of cyber defenders from historical Black colleges, universities, from underrepresented communities. The easier we can do that, as well as get digital resources into their hands earlier in age, the better we will be from a cyber defense standpoint. One of the public policy solutions that we have in CEO Action for Racial Equity is addressing the digital divide and supporting laws that are going to the Hill right to be discussed and hopefully passed to get broadband access, laptops, tools into the hands of individuals who typically won't see those type of assets, especially in rural environments, right? Where a lot of time the focus goes on those urban communities, and they certainly need help too, but even more so in the rural environments, right? Because there's not always that infrastructure in place to just just simply build upon what's already there, right? You have to start from the ground up.
No, absolutely. And I think each of those resources could make our journey even faster to building the capacity that we're looking for.
Right.
Right. And then with more thoughtfully crafted, structured programs. Jen, I think when we talk about the domestic aspect, there is also this international infusion of talent that's coming in. And you see kind of a broad angle for that whole funnel comes to you and of course other resettlement agencies. What do you see? How can we tap into that talent? And at what time? I think it's also a matter of like what time, right? Because they're coming from distress and they're trying to settle. What's your guidance of tapping into that talent?
It's a multi-generational approach. Initially when people get here, people want to be able to just grab someone and say, okay, let's bring them in. I would say the point at which they really need to enter is probably around 6 months. Because when someone first arrives, they're dealing with culture shock, they're dealing with all of those things, and depending on the situation, think about Afghanistan and Ukraine. There's a lot of trauma that people are experiencing. So a lot of times those entry-level first step jobs when they get here help them work through that. But then 6 to 12 months in, we really need to start getting them on track for a long-term career and getting them back into those places. But one of the things we have to be willing to talk about is what are we willing to work on in terms of language, in terms of cultural adjustments? Are you willing to make space for people to have midday prayers in your office? What are the things that we're willing to do and make adjustments for? But what they bring is so much more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about the underlying situation, right, the suffering and the pain is same, whether it's domestic or it's coming from someone, it's ultimately and fundamentally human. And then probably that's where our common underlying principle is that we lift it all together, and the resources that we put together is available for everyone to use.
And if I can, just to build on what Jen said, I mean, that is equity and inclusion, right? Like acknowledging that we all have different lived experiences. We have not all been granted the same opportunities as the three of us up here, right? We all have different experiences, but including them and recognizing that their experiences are different. But then, like Jen said, making that space for them, for everybody as individuals to be successful as a part of a team.
Sure, absolutely. And how do you go about changing culture? I think we had a pretty good session that was led by our good friend Dennis Gilbert, who has built like 2 massive operations programmatically within 2 public sector or private organizations. I think there is a notion of culture going from top down, and but there is a lot of shift in the bottom, right? People coming in and changing, especially we're talking about entry-level people and career changers who may not be perfect fit for the culture. So Anthony, maybe start with you. Your thought about how can we make that culture inclusive and be more open to having that change?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It starts at the top. It starts with vulnerability too, right? Your leadership has to be vulnerable and acknowledge that DE&I, whatever it looks like for your organization, is going to be a priority for your business success, right? There's numerous studies out there that DE&I drives success from a business bottom line standpoint. It's not just a side project anymore that we're going to do because people are asking for it. Like it drives business success. And so it starts from the top. As far as on the bottom is being inclusive, opening those doors. So for example, at MassMutual within our cybersecurity program, within 30 days, we want people to have development plans on skills that they want to work on. And then it's our job as leaders within the ECS program is to get them the resources that they need to be successful and make that space for them, again, from an equity inclusion standpoint, that they can take the time that they need during their work week to study, right? Or go to conferences, get them hooked up with mentors, and make sure that they understand that it's a part of their performance. It's a part of the leadership's performance. And when it comes time for, bonuses and accolades and all those things like that, we're going to look at, how your individual team, how our overall organization from a DE&I perspective performed within our cybersecurity organization.
And Jen, how do you take that to, because I think cybersecurity is, again, a very narrow space. How do you take the broad aspect that you have from DEI angle as well as providing people access to the basic resources to providing them access to learning and career opportunities?
I think one of the keys to anything when you talk about DEI is communication. If it's something that the executives talk about in the back room and say, we're going to try and do this, it's never going to happen.
Right.
Because it has to go all the way through the organization. So whether it's immigrants and refugees or it's general community, we've got to be talking about it and make sure that the whole organization is bought in. And we are talking about the cultural differences, having conversations with teams saying, okay, we now have this other population here. Culturally, these are things, they may not look you in the eye, or they may not speak up. You're going to have to pull them aside and ask their opinion and give that time and talk about those things so that everyone has the same opportunity. There are certain groups that, they won't look you in an eye or they won't speak up unless they are called on. And it takes time to adjust to that American culture to get them there. So I think awareness and communication and ensuring we're always talking about it is the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that applies to the domestic aspect as well, right?
Absolutely.
Especially, you don't see people, and I think Jen also mentioned about this when she was, rising up in the career. There are not too many women in her space. And same applies to the industry that we are in. Like, there are not so many women, but also there's not so many people of color. And it looks very same. Anthony, how do you go about making people take that jump, right? Especially for those candidates coming in, they're also taking a chance on people that they don't look like them or they don't think like them and they don't have the same life experiences.
Yeah, it's education, right? So I'll give two examples. At MassMutual, we have a tool called Degreed, and there's a number of different pathways that we do from an education standpoint. Most, business related, how MassMutual makes money, how you fit in the organization from a team standpoint, so on and so forth. But we also have education pathways on the Asian American communities, and Asian American Pacific Islander communities, LGBTQ plus communities, Black and African American, where we teach employees about the history about racism, right? That these communities faced within America, and how we got to where we got to today. So that way, the employees who may not have had that frame of reference, either in school or just their own communities, they now have a little bit of that, right? And so now they're a little bit educated. They understand some of the examples Jen gave from a cultural perspective about, okay, here's why this person isn't shaking my hand, right, when I put my hand out, or they're not looking at me, or they never speak up in meetings. Now you have that frame of reference, you know where to start. And again, equity comes into play, you know where to meet them, right, and make those concessions to make sure that they're just as successful. Within CEO Action for Racial Equity, we had to do the same thing in the fellowship, right, where we have a mix of people from different backgrounds that are operating as fellows within the fellowship. We all needed to learn about the Black community and the challenges they face from a systemic standpoint, right? Even myself, right, as a Black man in America, I didn't know everything that everybody faces within the Black community. So again, having that frame of reference, and we did that early on. We spent about a month just on education before we even started looking at solutions for a public policy or social contract perspective. So that way we understood, okay, here's what we're working towards, here's why we're doing the work, and here's what it needs to look like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, when we talk about the personal experiences and the expectations that we have for them to work in a profession like ours, which is high demand, you need to be available. Yeah. How do you relate that to that transition in the journey? Because I think that the challenge could be that somebody's trying to get childcare, get transport, and to do the job that they want, especially in the earlier stages, right? I have personally heard stories where people want to go to their job on time, but they take like 90 minutes to commute to that job, and they depend on public transport. What are your thoughts to make it more accessible to them, bring the jobs and opportunities to the communities rather than asking them to go somewhere that they have to make the commute? How do you address that the access issue?
Yeah, I'll go off of Naomi's point yesterday, right, where we just look at the way jobs are written, right, where you need 5 years of experience in a CSSP for an entry-level job, right? Like, you do the same thing with how the work is getting done. You don't need to physically be in the office to be a cybersecurity defender. Like, you just don't. There's certainly opportunities and times when we all want to be together in person and as a team, but like, that's for me anyways, and my team's like, that's far and few between. We have people all over the country that are working in roles, and from my perspective, as long as your stakeholders are happy and we're doing the job and the work is getting done, I tell them I could care less if you sign on at 6 a.m. and you're done by 12 and you're gone from 12 to 5 and you're back on at 8 p.m. until midnight. Like, if the work is getting done and that fits your schedule because of childcare needs or whatever else is going on, then great. If the work starts getting impacted, then, you know, we'll have that discussion. But it's about being accessible, right? And having that equity mindset where a normal 9 to 5 is not going to work for everybody, especially in these times, right? With COVID and working from home and all that stuff. I have 2 kids of my own, 4 and 2-year-olds. I feel it, and my 2-year-old has been on meetings with me, like, because we didn't have daycare, right? But being able to have a good manager and a good boss, a good leader that was open to that, and you know, is very helpful. So that, for me, that's what's worked.
Absolutely. I think that needs a strong leadership to do that, and I'm sure you
Right.
demonstrate that. And that's also a matter of trust, right? You're trusting them to do their job,
Right.
right? Coming back to Jen, your situation and the people that you're helping to get into new careers, like not only a new career but also a new life. How do you I think that even goes beyond what Anthony mentioned about like learning the American way of doing the job. I think we spoke about that earlier. How would you like to share some of the thoughts around that?
Well, I think it's being open to what they bring into the job. We have a very American way of doing things, but one of the beautiful things in my career right now is I work with people from all over the world, and some of the cultural pieces that they bring to the workplace, the importance of slowing down to have certain conversations, the focus on what is really important, where the process is. A lot of times they bring different perspectives. So not just on, you know, how to do the tasks, but the process. And so I think slowing down to honor and listen and not just assume that our way, the way it's always been done, is the best way.
Right.
We have a lot to learn from other cultures and ways of doing things. So really honoring that as people come in and stopping to listen and not just push them into the way it's always been done. It's really important.
Yeah. And what resources do you think they can tap into? And I think I'm referring to some of them as like Talent Beyond Boundaries. We got Upwardly Global that are established, but industry it has not so much engaged with that. And do you think we should do more, or you think already have the resources that we are not utilizing as much as we should?
There's a lot of resources not being used. There is an organization called Switchboard, and they do all kinds of, their sole focus, it's funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, to help create career pathways for immigrants, primarily refugees, but tons of resources. Department of Labor has a lot of resources. But if it's an area you're interested in recruiting from, find a local resettlement agency. There's 9 agencies. They're easy to find. They're in most major cities. Find them. And, you know, I ran an office in North Carolina for a while. We had a 30-year history, and that community is really tight. So all I would have to do is pick up the phone and say, hey, is there anyone in the community that knows how to do this? And, you know, one thing about the immigrant communities is word spreads really fast. And pretty soon you have 5 people at your door saying, yeah, they can do that. And so, you know, reach out, ask questions, and you'll get lots of response.
No, sure. And I think, you know, that also gives people the knowledge and the opportunity to learn something for the first time that they didn't know exists, right? And talking about tools and resources, you know, from a career pathway standpoint, I think we talked about a little bit with Krishna as well on this one, the internship, apprenticeship, and the full-time jobs. How do you see, you know, engagement in both your communities, and the kind of community representation? How do you see new tools being utilized, or how do we make sure that they are embraced and utilized? Like internship is very well understood. We are definitely working hard on the apprenticeship side. Do you see that working, or what should we learn from that process?
There's something more to do, right? I think there's always more to do, always improvements to be made. I think a lot of the work starts internally too. Even 3-4 years ago, us, right, as an organization, we weren't prepared for our interns, and we weren't prepared to give our interns the best experience, for that summer. Because, June 1st or whatever popped up and they were here at your desk and they needed something to do, right? And so you found something for them to do. But now we're intentional about having the space for the interns. We know how many of the interns we're going to be hold for specific diverse candidates. They're going to be assigned prior to, and the leader is going to set a plan for what they're going to be doing for that summer. And then we also have a subset of the interns that we have, the interns that we're actually going to bring on as contractors, right? And Naomi, I touched on that yesterday too, right? Well, we may not be able to bring them on as full-time employees, but our intention is that we're going to hire a subset of these groups of interns that are high performers, full-time contractors, and then ideally full-time employees. From a tool perspective, there's numerous tools out there from a training and learning development perspective outside of your respective organization that they can get that cybersecurity training experience, that knowledge, while in turn working hands-on with their respective leader and team that they're assigned to for that summer. One of the big things, and again, shout out to Self-Help Partners, is the apprenticeship program, right? And that's something that we want to take that next step further, both in the fellowship as well as MassMutual, because it really makes sure that those students early on, right, from freshman year in college and beyond, they're prepared for the job that they're getting ready to intern, apprentice for, and then ultimately the job that they end up getting hired for. And that helps everybody, right? That helps our organization, that helps our industry, helps the country, helps government, all that stuff. So the better we can get at that, I think the better for it we all will be.
Yeah, and then I think you touched upon the journey of all those three. This is maybe I'm personally curious about in the CEO for Action for Equity. Do you have a cybersecurity working group or some way you think that could help to bring more people from that community in?
No, not specifically around cybersecurity. Again, I mentioned the public policy around digital divide. Also with historic Black colleges and universities with Title IV funding, the schools have to meet certain IT and cybersecurity requirements. But it's a double-edged sword because the HBCUs, they typically don't have enough funding that they need just to stay up and running, right? Let alone advance their network security and their IT infrastructure. So that's where corporate America and private sector can help out, while at the same time, from a public policy perspective, getting the funds that these schools need that really it's their funds that they just haven't been given, over the last 100 years for whatever reasons. We can get into all that later, but from a private sector perspective, being the voice and the advocate for schools, voice advocate for these communities that don't have these digital assets to learn and to get into these jobs within cybersecurity.
Absolutely. And then I think we have the same issue from the resettlement community as well, right? Making sure people have access. And in fact, this is probably a good time to talk about the tech help desk that Jen, we kind of putting together. We want to highlight the access to the content a little bit and the plan.
So we've been talking about how do we find people? And so really looking at, we have to go to them and make sure that they have access to know how to find the jobs. So we've been working on a plan to physically go to communities to reach into those networks, spend some time there and enroll people into a database and a process to get them moving towards finding that career, whether it's the education, if they're ready for the actual job, what it is, but whether it's going to Sacramento, where there's more than 10,000 Afghans that have been there for 15, 20 years in some cases. How do we dip into those pockets of people, find the talent that already is there and use the skills they have? They may not be American degrees, but they have degrees from Kabul University or somewhere else that their skills, their knowledge is useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, getting that parity, at least get an understanding of the parity is important, because then we can, as business professionals, we can tap into them at different levels, not just the current level of expectation we have. The same applies to the communities that are underserved communities in the country. May Anthony, go to you in terms of reaching out to them. So we had great plans in terms of making sure we have a lot of great content, make the platform available. how do you communicate? What are the channels of communication we should use to reach out to the underrepresented communities? Because nowadays you can say, okay, people have a cell phone and they don't probably get to it, but there's so much noise. How do we cut through that and get to a point where we can articulate to them the value of the industry, this industry particularly, and the opportunities that they have?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple ways. I'll always go back to representation matters. So having those communities see themselves in the cybersecurity industry is going to go further than anything else, really, right?
So the visual representation itself is important.
Absolutely, right? Because like I go back to elementary school, finding out that the person who invented peanut butter and the stoplight was black, like that blew my mind as a 6-year-old, right? That, hey, somebody who looks like me can do something so impactful, that something that everybody eats every day and everybody uses every day around the street was black. Like, okay, I'm going to study hard. I'm going to do this, right? And so they need to be able to see that from a cybersecurity perspective too, because typically, and I'll speak for the Black community, it's not a first job, right, that you think of to go into from an IT perspective. My father was in IT, so that was kind of my bridgeway into it. So representation matters, and then utilize the systems that are in place today, right? And again, I'll go back to HBCUs. They have cybersecurity organizations and departments, cybersecurity courses that they're doing. They just need the partnerships there, right? So utilize some of the work that they've already done internally with those students and give them the resources that they need, right, for those apprenticeship programs, for those jobs, because that's what the schools want, right? And so that's how you're going to reach out to those communities. You're going to utilize those students, right, at those schools to go back to their communities, right, because they're not just going to stay within their schools. And that's how it's going to get started there.
And if I can add, I think one of the things we have to be really aware of is when we're approaching, whether it's communities here in the US or immigrant communities, the socioeconomic level of people matters. So if you're going to offer an internship,
Right.
make sure it's paid and paid at a level that they can survive, because most of those kids, those immigrants, they have a family that money is going back to support. They're not just paying for themselves, they're also giving money to their families to help their families survive. So if you want them in your businesses, you're going to have to put that money up front as an intern.
Yeah, so I think especially in cyber, I would say paid internships are a must, because that work, every bit of work that's done is less work for the leadership and the program itself.
Absolutely.
And I think I have not seen unpaid cyber internship. Hopefully, you don't have to, but that's definitely a way to get in. The other question that I had, again from the community as well as from my own curious perspective, is that how do we make the communities kind of leverage each other's help and support, right? I think that the inclusiveness comes from understanding each other's pain, suffering, of course, philosophically speaking, but also resources that are available. Is it possible that we put one resource that could be tapped into by multiple communities? Is it a physical thing, or something that we should think about more broadly? That I'm talking specifically about help desk initiative that we are starting, right? If we put a help desk at some place and location which could be utilized, is it a community college or is it a school? Your thoughts on it, and again, a very open question, I believe. Right? Where do you put the resource, and how because the physical access is very important, and I think physical access to devices, to networks, especially in cyber, when you have, if you want to have a cyber range, you can't just have like under-resourced, devices. So any thought on how can you bring it closer to the community? That curveball was coming.
I guess there's different ways, right? Like to do that. Certainly having community centers there with internet access and putting it where the people are, right, where the community is, and make sure that it's accessible for them. Again, I'll go back to the HBCU example with IBM and Apple and the innovation center that they're creating with the Atlanta HBCUs there. That's open to all HBCUs. That just happens to be in Atlanta. But bringing that available to those students there, because what we hear from students, like right here with the University of DC, is that they have students, they have all online classes, but they don't have Wi-Fi at their apartment. So they have to come to campus anyways in order to do their homework and attend the classes. So ways like that from a technology digital divide standpoint, I think from an employee community standpoint, it'll look different from organization to organization. I'll go back to the education piece, but as long as, we have that understanding that, again, people have different lived experiences, and we need to take that equitable approach and be there for one another, that's going to go a long way. And be mindful of like what is going on in the world, and that the way George Floyd's murder might impact me differently than it did Jen. Like, just be mindful of that. I go back to that week where I had a lot of people asking me if I was okay, and I had said nothing, right? I was going through the week just as I go through any other week, but the personal side of Anthony was thinking about this thing. But I appreciated people asking me like, hey, are you okay? Just let me know if you want to talk, things like that. So I think being mindful of what's going on in the world and how employees might be impacted with worldly events. With the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we have the GCC captive employees out in Romania who have family in the Ukraine, right? That is weighing on their shoulders, right? And so being there, giving them the space, the time that they need, and understanding like, hey, the work is going to be there when you're ready. This doesn't need to get done today, right? Like, take the time you need. So again, I think just being there, right, and understanding that access looks differently for different communities and different people.
Absolutely. And how do you see the access from your standpoint being the kind of not only the issue, but also kind of creatively thinking and solving for the access issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's ensuring education people know where they can get resources. There's a lot of people that don't know I can go to the library and get free Wi-Fi to do job applications, do those things. But it's also really that in-person, that relationship is what's important, because in the immigrant community, there's a lot of trust that has to be built. And so if there is a trusted place or person, they are going to go there. And the recommendation of that person, organization, is what's going to drive where they go for the additional help. So I think even with the help desk or anything else, you're going to have strong relationships with all these organizations, so that when those populations go there, to the community centers, to the resettlement agencies, whatever, they're going to be able to say, yes, this is a good place to go. Here, let me drive you there and introduce you myself.
Yeah,
that's what we were talking about with Thurgood Marshall College Fund and United Negro College Fund. Like, if they say no, you're not getting into those schools, period, right? Because those schools trust those two organizations. You got to build that trust, build a relationship with those two organizations first, and then you can start building that with the school. So just another example there, what Jen said.
Yeah, and then the trust building itself is a exercise of time and, and effort, right?
Yeah, because they've been burned before, right?
So maybe this is a wrap-up question about how do we make this a more stronger community mentor-mentee network, because I think there are people willing to give, there are people definitely need that resources. So how can we curve time and also engage in a mentor-mentee relationship? You want to touch upon that, because you're a mentor yourself, I'm sure. And how do you engage with the mentees, and how do you find time to do that?
Yeah, be intentional about it, right? And don't wait for them to come to you. Like, go to them, go find potential mentees and people who want to crack into the cybersecurity industry. There's plenty of opportunities to do that, right? Whether presentations like this, discussions like this, go to your alma mater, different chapters, organizations that you're a part of. Reach out to them, right? See if there's anything you can help with. You may not always get responses. One of the things, my former boss, Jim Routh, right, our former CISO at MassMutual, he always had us essentially cold calling potential candidates, even if we didn't have jobs open at MassMutual, so that way, and diverse candidates. So that way, when the time came that we did have a job opening, we already knew who we wanted to go after, right? And so throughout this time, we're having conversations with, whether it's a formal mentor-mentee relationship or just conversations ongoing about what they want to learn, how they want to develop. Was very helpful, right? And again, that goes to where they are versus just waiting. They're like, hey, we're MassMutual, we're a Fortune 100 company. Like, of course you want to work with us. Like, they may not know who MassMutual is, right? That we even exist. So if we go to them, we can educate them about, hey, here's some of the opportunities that we have. That's how we can start developing that relationship. And then again, back to that representation matters. Their friends and their colleagues start seeing that, hey, MassMutual is a diverse company. They're a company that wants to develop and retain their employees, and again, meet them from an equitable approach. That's how we do it to meet that.
Absolutely. And then just a plug here for the platform that we have, cyberfuture.community. If you have not used that, please use that resource. That's especially was built for those that are going into the apprenticeship program, so that along with the learning content, they are the mentor-mentee platform. And hopefully we can have more and more people engaged there, right?
Absolutely.
And then Jen, I'm sure that's kind of similar from your standpoint, but is there a specific cultural nuance in the mentor-mentee relationship
I
in the
don't
refugee
know.
community?
The nuance, I think, is more being willing to tackle sensitive topics. And, you know, written English is really hard for a lot of people. And being willing to sit down and part of the mentor relationship, completely non-judgmental and understanding those barriers and being willing to support them through those, even, you know, when you're looking at career skills, but looking at some of the simple things that may be the big barriers for them and helping them with those things that sometimes we overlook or take for granted.
Absolutely. Well, we're at the final couple of moments and minutes. Anybody has any questions? Of course, Katie.
Thank you so much. It's been such a great session. And Jennifer, you stole my question because I got another one though. I'm so glad you mentioned that though about the unpaid internship. I know I talked with Dr. Robbie Melton at Tennessee Tech. You know, she said these are the kinds of invisible barriers to entry that a lot of companies don't realize they're erecting.
Right.
So that disproportionately students of color are not able to take advantage of an unpaid internship opportunity, whatever the industry. And so then they're immediately put at a disadvantage when it comes to applying because they have no relevant experience. Well, they don't have relevant experience because they need to earn income. And that opportunity was not made possible. So, but when she and I were speaking, one of the things that it prompted the thought, and Anthony, you spoke to this a little bit, but I would love to hear from both of you. Organizationally, it requires a commitment. Look, it requires a commitment from an organization to do the type of work that you're talking about to increase diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility. Who are some of the sort of best, I guess, promising practices that you could point to in terms of who are some of the types of internal stakeholders that an organization needs to grab a hold of, so that it's not just sort of performative statements about DEI, but that it's actually operationalizing it. So both internal stakeholders and then what are some promising practices, which is examples that you can share of identifying external stakeholder partners. Because I think a lot of companies do genuinely want to do better in this area, but they might just not know where to start. So who are the people they need to sort of get on bus?
Well, we were talking yesterday about, you know, one of the things that we started doing a few years ago is my team, there's an expectation. If you're hiring, 50% of your panel participants have to be non-white American. Our organization is historically a very white one, you know, that white savior complex of we're going to come in and save these people and take care of them. You know, we recognize that's wrong, but it means we have an organization with 400 staff where the top leadership is 80% white. How do we change that? Well, if all of our panels, all the people that are doing the hiring look like us, you know, whether we intend it or not, we tend to hire people like us. So change up who's doing the hiring, bring those perspectives in. They will ask questions differently than maybe I would. And then really communicate out the change that you see over time. So I've started twice a year saying, you know, this is what our staffing looks like now. This is what it looked like 6 months ago, 18 months ago. And people see that change happening, and that drives people's energy. Because if we do it and change is happening, but you never show people what it looks like, they lose the passion and energy for it. They're like, oh, I gotta go sit on another interview panel. You know, let's show them where the impact is and how it's changing things. That's the simplest
So the decision
one.
makers you're talking about, I know addressing Katie's question, the decision makers matter and they need to be intentional about what they want to see in the candidate.
And including other people in the decisions, whether it's hiring or other things. You know, if I'm the only one making the decision about something that's going to affect a refugee community, I've missed the boat. There needs to be a refugee voice in that speaking to what's going to impact them.
And to build on that, right, when you talk about practices, I don't know if everybody had the chance to watch the panel that we did earlier this week, but James Stanley, one of the participants, he said transparency will put you on the path to truth, right? Yeah. Being transparent about, here's what our numbers are, good or bad, right? Again, leading with vulnerability so that you know where you want to get to. You have to know where you started, right? So, and include your employees, include not just leadership, right? Here's where we are today. Here's what we're doing to combat it, right? And take advantage of this opportunity. And here's where we are 6 months from now. Here's where we are 12 months from now. We fell back a little bit because of X, Y, and Z reason, but here's what we're going to do to correct it. So being transparent with your employees, being transparent externally, will go a long way. As far as stakeholders, human resources, law, DE&I communities that you have within different organizations will go a long way too. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but well-intentioned individuals, right, in groups, they all want to do the right thing, right? They all want to do focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're all speaking from the same page, right, and singing from the same song sheet. That way, it's diversity, equity, inclusion. What it means for a cybersecurity organization means the same thing for Mass Mutual as a whole, for the law department, risk, whatever it is. So having that central kind of governance structure, if you will, within inside of your organization will go a long way too.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, thank you both for joining us. I think
Absolutely.
It's a continued conversation to be continued. We started on a great note. I think some of the actions we need to see fairly quickly, and hopefully we can see that by the time we meet next time.
Yeah.
So thank you, Anthony.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again for having us.
Thank you.
Well, to keep things on time, I would like to get us, ready for the next fireside chat, and this is something that I think everybody should tune into. Those that are online, please pay attention. I think this is the conversation next is with Rodney Peterson and Dr. Burley, kind of discussing around the readiness for our goal to get to a more inclusive panel. I think we have a little bit of time gap between now and then, so take your time to kind of get to know each other. We have about 30 minutes, I believe, between now and then. So yeah, you're good. If you're rushing, sorry. Yeah. And then we'll break for lunch at 11:30. Come back for the final panel.